Welcome to our Youth Parliamentary Network. We are having an exciting conversation. Can I suggest possibly the evolution of various parties? Various, as young people say, rare letters in the alphabet, right? We have so many evolutions. Is this a manifestation of, number one, probably the standing parties and communicating efficiently? Is this an identification of people looking for change, looking for something different, whereby the current political communication, where people aren't feeling, including in the messaging, people are looking for that type of change? So let's take it to you, Jenny. You talked about the evolution of the PDP coming to the fore, bringing that change. Now we have the evolution of a TPP, all right? So, and in our Trinidad space, we have so many, all right? And ever so often, when we think they don't exist, they revive, for another electoral cycle. So tell me a little bit about, do we see a rise of various parties, an expression of a search for change where people are looking to exercise their franchise because they're in a search for options?
Okay, so my comment might be very contentious. I'm giving you a heads up. So for me, I would not say that because we have a surge in so many new political parties, it's because persons are seeking change and they are not contented with the options available. What I would say, in many instances, and I don't want to offend anyone, but you would find that a lot of parties form from former disenchanted members of other political parties as well. And I'm not going to dispute that there are persons with genuine intentions who think that they can offer something new and really meet the needs of our electorate, right? But what you do find is that a lot of new parties form out of disagreements with former parties, and I'm glad that you mentioned the situation with the PDP evolving. Well, I wouldn't really say evolving. Moving on to the TPP, because that again was another instance where it was more of a personal disagreement between persons, and it just speaks to the level of politics that we have here in Trinidad and Tobago. But I appreciate and I see the value of new parties evolving in Trinidad. We have PEP, we have the Patriotic Front as well. Very interesting to see Michaela Pandey put herself forward for leadership. And as we continue to talk about women taking up more leadership responsibilities, sometimes we as women need to take that stance. And I commend Michaela Pandey for her very bold step in putting herself forward. So they will meet and be palatable to those that are interested in what they have to offer. To some extent, I would say they kind of represent the persons who are not usually polarized on our side. So they have that sway or that interest in the persons who don't usually vote. But the problem with us here in Trinidad and Tobago is that even though we have this surge or proliferation in these new political parties, you don't find them actually getting the support, and that's another question. Because I actually made a TikTok on this, because you would find that we psychologically, we think that we have to vote based on a two-party system. So you have two main parties, other parties come forward, a lot of persons think they're not gonna win, that's a wasting a vote. So the question is, when do we evolve from that mindset? Because I think most persons are not contented with the options available. Maybe I shouldn't say most, but a lot of persons, but they don't convert that lack of support for the parties presently into a vote for other parties. So when do we kind of transition into supporting these new parties nationally?
And that's a key question. So Jenny raised something key, and I'm coming directly to you, Chris, and then I'll pivot to you, Shane. The key question that we're trying to unearth here is, we have experienced an expansion of our suffrage. It's universal, right? And since 1946, we've seen that expansion, but at the same time, we've seen historically a decline in that participation or access of that franchise. But historically, we've also seen an increase of options. So there's a diametric, evolution that is taking place. Increased options. So politically, we have a la carte before us. We're in that buffet or restaurant. But the participation has been subsiding, on the other side. So there's a diametric relationship that we're seeing. But is this a causal relationship, as you're saying? Not necessarily. An increase in option means an increase of quality of representation or increase in speaking to what voters require at this time. So I'm going to pivot to you, Chris, by asking, has the evolution and the increased presence of various political parties, has it strengthened our democracy or has it weakened our democracy?
Well, I think it has always strengthened our democracy. I think there are many things that happened here, and I want to just comment on a few things. So we're looking at 100 years, right? And to me, that is a pillar of our strength and democracy, yeah, as a nation. We have the opportunity to reform this. Mm-hmm. Of course, we discussed the history of this. We discussed how it would have been ineffective and the changes that would have made to make it a bit more effective for that time and that context then. And similarly now, just recently, I don't know if we're still talking about constitutional reform. Mm-hmm. And so when we speak about political parties, that big word, campaign, two words, campaign financing is one, yeah? Janae said something about the dissidents, basically, yeah, the persons of dissent in political organizations. I think dissent in a political organization is great. If we look historically, Mr. Pandey in 1988 would have descended from the NAR, then further became the Prime Minister. If we look at Dr. Rowley, yeah? And not just that, he would have sustained being the Prime Minister for 2 consecutive terms. Even if we look at Mrs. Wasabi-Sessa, some persons don't know, in 1991, she ran under the banner of NAR against the UNC. And then now is the UNC political leader, well, once was the Prime Minister. So dissent is a great thing, because democracy means that we all have the right to express ourselves and discuss how best we see this thing working or what we can do to make it work. So I think this idea of loyalty to leader and loyalty to party is a problem, and we see it in the major political parties right now. That's what we see. And we are told that if you have the conversation outside, which I think is quite transparent, I want to know the conversation that is happening in there. It is what crab and barrel, what it is? You're washing you're washing your linens outside. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that is an act of democracy. I think when we look at the constitutional reform, we want to have more agents of transparency and accountability. Right now we're discussing a big issue nationally with the Police Service Commission and all of those different things. Maybe we should have confirmation hearings. I heard an attorney speak about it recently. I was reading it in the papers, and I found that to be quite an interesting thing, an interesting way in which we can up the ante when it comes to transparency and accountability. What I will say is that the dwindling voter turnout means we're uninterested or we're not interested. And it is because of the political product. It is because of the message. It is because of the type of campaigns. The campaigns are not focused around substance. The campaigns are focused around sometimes propaganda. For example, in the Tobago space, there's a conversation happening about autonomy. The conversation happening about, well, if you're defining Tobago, define Trinidad as well, or not, or whatever. The conversation happening about equity of status, because certain services are not offered there, which I agree with. But then you can hear that argument being made. And the opposition to that argument is, well, them saying they want secession. No one spoke about that, right, as English. So that confusion is what turns us off, because again, you have a more informed population. So you can't tell us, well, they want that and we're going to believe it.
Right. So you're talking about representative democracy. And the word representative is to represent what the population requires. So to your question, where you are giving examples of partial communication, or to your example, propagandizing of national issues, which do not represent, constituents. And even though they aren't your constituent, you are part of a parliamentary system that must seek national interests and must seek that bipartisan conversation.
I'm glad you said that, because we have 41 members of parliament, right? Do our parliamentarians, when they go to debate a bill, whatever it is, do they actually consult with the constituents that, well, here's the agenda, this bill is coming up, what do you think? And I find that to be interesting. I mean, we know the answer, because we live here, right? We still live here, right? We're not living anywhere, we live here. And that's flawed. Again, constitutional reform, we can maybe discuss also the right to recall your MP.
Yeah.
That should be something that we should have as well.
And we're definitely going to have, as we wrap up, and thank you so much for introducing especially two key topics about campaign finance reform, more representative, democracy, increasing the access of us having a say. And that's something going to be key, and we're all going to have an opportunity to make those recommendations as we look forward to the next 100 years. But as we answer that key question that Chris would have raised and, Janae would have expanded on, tell me a little bit, Shane, do we think that political dissent or varying political views in the national conversation, is it accepted?
I think so, because sorry. I think so, because one, you have a clear majority and you have a clear minority in the parliament, say 41 seats, as well as a municipality. Out of the 14 corporation, you have 7 split equally amongst the two political parties in the parliament of Trinidad and Tobago. And in Tobago, you have different views, where you have the 14-1 ideology there. So of course, yes, political ideologies and different views are accepted by society, but I want to take a little step back and make sense of the entire conversation. I mean, Janae spoke about Michaela Pandey and her uprising of a political party. And so when you look at your political processes across the years, and you have the People's National Movement, which boasts of celebrating 60 years plus of being a political party, and you have United National Congress being booted out of the currently Labour Front and that movement, right? 30 plus years of being in existence. And you have starter parties that come with different views and different opinions. And I think sometimes they miss the mark. And in my opinion, I think that Michaela has missed the mark. In terms of our history, and how political parties are established, where you go into the community, you talk with each community and so forth. What you see happening is a gaslighting approach, from my opinion. And you speak on TikTok now and you send out a press release because you have 500 or how much ever followers on Facebook and Instagram, but you don't really go into the community and to bolster your base. And I want to use an example. The Watson Duke of today, because in politics as young people, we shy away from talking about political involvement, which is something that we ought not to do. But we must examine the things that present itself. So very quickly, to make my point. Watson Duke, that is now the descendant of the TPP party. The Watson Duke entered into the house by himself. And then he brought on the now Chief Secretary, Fali Chavez Agustin, they went in with 2 persons and Faye joined them as a counselor. And he built that movement. They then went to 6 persons. And now they are at 14 or 13, well, they are 13 now, 13-1-1, because Watson is by himself. So you understand that Watson Duke in his political journey understood what I think some of these pop-up parties don't understand in terms of building your base, because the UNC and the PNM, as well as now the TPP, they have a base, but you have a political entity, as Michaela, saying that she wants to be Prime Minister of your country, and she has posted out candidates now, and it almost seems as though, who did you consult to select these people to represent your party? And so therefore, when we look at history and so forth, and we ask ourselves, coming back to Chris' point, in terms of why the 2-party system is working and why we have to stay here, is because your 2-party system has been centered in history and historical development, where you have that conversation in your communities and so forth. And it goes back to even Eric Williams' days in terms of his understanding about the role of your community centers and your role of your community itself into the political process. And when you look at that cross-section, so a party can pop up today and say, I am so and I want to be political leader and Prime Minister, but you have to go back and understand the base of the politics and so forth, and it's there for us. So I feel as though 100 years in 2025, and I'll close here, we are going towards the vote. We have, I think, 3 major parties offering themselves. Patriotic Fronts, PNM, and United National Congress. 2 parties that have built their base. One that is saying that they are the alternative. But you ask yourself, have they built their base to be that alternative that we are so longing to see what we're asking for?
So to your question, and more so to your contribution, Shane, you are speaking to how do you expand and activate the suffrage or this franchise that has been made available to us. Because from 1946, we initially had just about a 6% representation of people being able to access. Then there was this cultural access or cultural change that brought people into the conversation. Now in that evolution to my original question, has the evolution and the presence of additional parties, has that strengthened democracy or has it weakened it? And now we're examining that on one hand, there is an increased presence of alternate views. And in a democracy, anyone has a right, based on our laws. Our People and Representation Act allows persons to bring themselves forward with a base, no base, but a simple idea. We are here at the Parliament, and just a stone's throw away, before the idea of the People's National Movement was the University of Watford Square. One man will come and have conversations with people. So my question, to us, even as we look at our voting patterns, we look internationally that, for instance, we just came out of a very bruising election in the US. They have a dominant 2-party system. Their system is institutionalized. Next year they will be celebrating, I believe, it's 250 years of being an independent nation. That's twice our journey, right? We are a baby in quite respects. So my question is, are persons speaking to that issue, or let me put it differently, what do you think would be the burning issues of those who have this access to vote? Because we're talking about 100 years of being able to vote or to lend their voice. The US experience, it was about immigration, foreign policy, it was about economy. What will be the conversation in this 2025? We're talking about the near future. 2025 is a landmark of 100 years. What do you think? So there's going to be a jump ball, but I'll have you tee it off and anyone else could chime in thereafter. What do you think will be the electoral issues of Trinidad and Tobago in this 2025 electoral process?
One of the things I like to focus on is health. We need to look at understanding, we spend so much on health and education in our national budget. And I think we need to look at understanding issues right now that affect us, such as non-communicable diseases, hypertension, cancer, diabetes, and those things are linked to our diets now. And when we think of diseases and health, we think of older folks. Right. But I want us to think about us as the youth, right? And everyone, every age, in fact, because when you look at non-communicable diseases, it's more lifestyle choices that influence those outcomes. And now, in an age of globalization, we have fast foods, we have more sedentary lifestyles, right? So I think that's one of the things that we should focus on. One of the other podcasts we did recently was on agriculture and involving the youth in agriculture. We undermine the powerfulness that is in agriculture and producing our own food. And in there I said globalization as well. Yeah. That is something that is all-encompassing and has so many issues that affects the Caribbean in terms of employment, in terms of media, so many things. I think reproductive rights as well. That is something that we see being discussed in the States and maybe in progressive and backward ways. But I think it is something that we can pull from and focus on in our own way. And yeah.
Sorry.
Yes.
So you are, if I'm to hear you correctly, so there are a lot of topics.
Yes.
That doesn't make it a mainstream conversation, right? You're talking about agriculture. You're talking about, how do we see women in that conversation? But anyone, what other key issues do you think? And it's probably a two-part. You might think this is going to be an issue, and you might tell me, well, this is what they're actually going to talk about. But we're having a youth conversation, and as part of this parliamentary process and really elevating the conversation or adding to the conversation, what do you see should be a key part of the conversation as we really commemorate this landmark as we pass this milestone of 100 years?
Just adding to what Faith said, we have so many issues amongst us: crime, unemployment, the economy, and whatnot. And when we look at the manifestos of both political parties, when we go through and we read it, it's not a bad plan, even on both sides. We may support one party or the other, but both plans are good. I think the issue, though, is not the message, but the messenger. And that is important, because when you have persons keeping away from elections, when you have youth not involved in elections, the political parties themselves have to ask the question, why? What are we doing wrong that we are not attracting those 10,000 voters in most constituencies that do not go out and vote? Why the youth? Why are they not attracted to us? Why are they not giving us their vote? And I think that is important for this election. We have seen past elections where the message, yes, they came with the plans, the policies, but just how it was carried out, the messenger, something was wrong there. And I believe that is something that needs to change in order to attract everyone this upcoming election.
Because we are in a space of controversial politics. Yes. And the political space and voting behavior will experience some form of contestation. If you look at our experience in the Western Hemisphere, there are a lot of political changes that are taking place. Some planned, some unplanned. You have Canada's coming into a snap election. France is seeing agitations of change. We have the US election that just took place. And one of the key questions I want to ask about political communication, a lot of the research on political communication tells us that as a voter, you will go through 3 stages, where there's the introduction of that message, and then you'll be inundated with that message. From that message, you can go into saturation. And in that saturation process, you can move from the subject of the ad or the communication to the sponsor of the ad. So you get a reverse reaction. So do we see voters still being inundated by a message, one, that doesn't speak to them, and 2, is creating this high level of withdrawal in the political space?
When you craft a message, in your strategic messaging campaign, you will set out who your target audience is, because the numbers will dictate that. You will know who falls within your base, and whatever you say, they will support. You will know the voters you need in the marginal constituencies like San Fernando West, St. Joseph, Tunapuna, Sandy Grande, La Hocata, I mean a few others, but more so San Fernando West and St. Joseph. You would know those things. Even in the Tobago space, I think this election is going to be interesting to see what happens there as well. And, you know, some things were mentioned here about having a base and some political parties not having a base. And I find we're in 2025, yeah? We're talking 100 years. And if your political organization's base is only based on ethnicity and an identity, then I find that flawed. And so there is a space now for a real political home that is in 2025. Because the reality is that we are not divided by ethnicity anymore. We are not divided by religion neither. We are not even divided by gender. And so there is space for a new political organization that offers something different. I think you give it a chance, see what happens. But yes, so back to the question, I think it's the targeting. I don't think I'm the target audience. I don't know about you all. Shanta is correct. If you go through the manifestos, they are actually well written, you know. I think there's an implementation deficiency.
Yes.
Right? Maybe that might be an issue. But of course, when they get to the political hustings, again, if this is your productive manifesto, I mean, you go through it, it makes a lot of sense. And then you get to the campaign, and you hear nothing about that, but all about your opponents, and who good, who not good, when they were there, what they didn't do. I mean, that serves no purpose in really helping me make a decision. You know, like Shane said, it's bacchanal. So I am looking forward, I'm still being optimistic. I am looking forward to hearing about AI and its impact on the labor market. I'm looking forward to hearing about how we are going to diversify our partners in terms of our gas sector, because of course, you know, there's the geopolitics of it. And even though we are in negotiations or we have this gas deal with Venezuela, we know what's happening around the world. We know there's someone new in Washington. So that too is something we obviously will have to consider in our decision making and in the product we put forward on the ballot. Of course, I'm looking at the reform of the education sector. I mean, we can't be doing things the same way over and over and over. Maybe we need to incentivize some areas, some niche markets that are expanding. I am looking forward to hearing more about renewables. I know many persons think it's a switch you turn on, it's not like that. So at least feasibility reports, new investors. Those are the things I am looking forward to hearing from. Because we need to correct this foreign exchange crisis, yes? So, and crime. It's a big ticket item, and hopefully it's not a political football, and I hope the Tobago autonomy is not going to be used, watching Johnny, as a political football as well.
But Chris, you spoke to a lot of things. But one, you spoke about education, and earlier on you mentioned constitutional reform. Education, you talk about political parties not being able to communicate well and identify proper target audience, us being young people under 35. But one of the things, to the flip to that, I think that there ought to be sensitization that does not end at Form 3, telling young people the importance of the exercising their franchise to vote. Because I feel as though that is just glossed over, and just a small portion of young people understand what it means to vote. And you have each year when persons graduate from CSEC and CAPE, you have 18,000 plus young people coming into society, and they don't understand what it means to vote, why should they be voting, and so forth. And
government level as well.
yeah, and to flip to that, I also just want to touch on having regards to constitutional reform. I think if it's placed in the Constitution that our political parties that are offering themselves, or the persons that are offering themselves to represent persons in a constituency, one, there should be national debates recognized by the Constitution, identifying the issues in each constituency, and two, as it relates to constitutional reform, I think that we need to start identifying what is the role of a member of parliament. 100 years and we are still yet in our constitution to identify what is the role and responsibility of our member of parliament. And if those things are not addressed, we will be stuck where we don't understand where we are going or what even do we need a member of parliament for.
So you've identified a key area, probably even an area of improvement for our constitution as we look forward into the next 100 years, where we see a civic mindedness, not just a full appreciation of our franchise, but a civic mindedness or a duty to be a part of, one, a national conversation, two, presenting our solutions, and three, probably even accepting that this conversation does not have to take place in formal channels. Because many of the social movements that are taking place, either from a media perspective, we are now talking about alternate media, where people are getting their information no longer from traditional media, TV and news, but they are going to their podcasts, they're going on TikTok, they're going on all these different mediums to have that type of conversation, or to the Tobago experience, which would have ushered in PDP, a social conversation at, what we might talk about a fireside chat. Watson Duke would have boasted that he started his party with him, his brother, and his dog under a lamppost, and that national conversation would have started there and create that groundswell. So my question is, when we look at the involvement of the electorate, accessing their franchise or being a part of that national conversation, we did allude very early in the conversation that there has been a decline in that participation from the heights of 80% to our last, I believe, 2020, around 58%. We saw a slight uptick in our most recent local government by-election in Lengua, whereby it moved from, I believe, around 36% upward to 39%. Though marginal, you don't expect to see an upward tick in a local government election. So it's a point of note to say even in a local government election, there was an increase and the PNM would have gotten that type of support. And even the burden of incumbency itself is also a miracle in itself, right? Because you have the burden of incumbency, but yet a groundswell of support. So to you, as we look into the future, I want to ask a question, and I will start with you, and then we all could chime in. What strategies can be used by political parties to increase, not just political parties and the ABC, to increase voter turnout and engagement?
Okay, so firstly, I think the main problem that our electorate faces is the lack of performance and the lack of palatable alternatives. So I think most persons don't vote because they are not happy with the performance. You could talk and give formal speeches and meet and greet, but if it's not backed by performance, if you're not effective in delivering your plan and you have a track record of underperformance, then persons will get blindsided, persons will turn a blind eye to you, and persons will not take you seriously. So I think our politicians need to start upholding their word in terms of delivering their plans and projects. You know, life happens, and the reality is when you're met with so much bureaucratic red tape, sometimes everything that you put in your manifesto cannot feasibly be achieved. But for the most part, you find a situation where persons campaign and they canvass and they knock on your doors, and then after election, you don't see them in some instances, or you don't hear from them as much as you would like. Or sometimes you may go to your member of parliament, and for some extent, they are inaccessible to you. So I think members of parliament, aspiring politicians, need to increase their visibility and access to the electorate. And I think in that way, persons may be more impelled to vote or lend their support to you, as well as, I know a lot of persons would have alluded to this, the messaging. We have to look at the concerns of the electorate in this present time. So when we're looking at our national discourses, I wanted to mention this. I know Shanta spoke a little bit about crime. You know, there are many issues affecting Trinidad and Tobago right now, and I think for the most part, persons just want a sustainable economy. And so our politicians, aspiring and present, need to come with really tangible and feasible plans that will appeal to our electorate. And also, again, we have to acknowledge that there are persons of different educational levels in our society. So sometimes within the political messaging, we oftentimes neglect those who may not be as academically inclined. So, you know, we need to go back to that level of grassroots politics where you appeal to the layman on the street in terms of getting their concerns and finding a way to code your message in a way that they would understand and feel appreciated, and their concerns would be met adequately. And last but not least, one thing I wanted to mention, in Austria and I think Brazil, their eligible age for voting is 16. Now we say that youth is age, I think is 12 to 35 according to the recent national youth policy. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. But I do believe that, you know, there's a lot of ageism within our political landscape where we assume that a 16-year-old or a 15-year-old doesn't have the logic or doesn't have that level of awareness to vote. And I think that going forward, these are things that we can possibly consider, because if we go in on logic and the ability to make an informed decision, your prefrontal cortex, which is the part responsible for logic and reasoning, is really only fully developed at 25. So if we're using that argument, what is the difference between an 18-year-old and a 16-year-old, or maybe a 15-year-old being able to vote and make a reasonable political decision, noting that their concerns are also valid because the actions of politicians also affect them as a young person. So that is something that I would like to see addressed in terms of if we could have some kind of reform, or can we extend the franchise even further to meet the persons who are often neglected within our political landscape.
Thank you so much for that, Shanta. So you're proposing a solution of deepening the age group to encourage more engagement. And, you know, that's an interesting proposal, because the developmental process of Gen Zs and even those who are coming up is at an exponential rate now. Motor function, you know, the exposure of AI and technology and gamification, you know, people think, you know, individuals think at a much more rapid pace. When I look at my 6-year-old son, daughter, and my 8-year-old son, I know my wife is going to get buff me for saying that, you know. I'm sorry, baby. But when you look at that, the development stage is rapid. So there is some credence in what you're sharing. So what are solutions, Faith, and then it'll be open to anyone else. What can we do to increase engagement? We just have about 5 more minutes, so let's bring that solution. What can we do to increase engagement and participation in our elections?
I actually wanted to add on to what Chris said. I think that the mechanisms used a lot in campaigning now, it's fear-mongering, and we speak about the youth being more informed now. I think we do still have actually issues where we are divided by ethnicity, we are divided by religion, we are divided by race, and we can't ignore that. We shouldn't be, though, which is your point, and so there is opportunities for other political parties and persons to come on and create a new base. But of course, as Shane mentioned, there is the need for a base. You can't just project a manifesto into a vacuum or a space. Right? There needs to be, you need to appeal to the grassroots, as Janae said as well.
An appreciation of sociology, right, and social groups, right?
You need to appreciate the social groups, the community, the civil organizations, as I mentioned earlier. And even going back to our history, looking at how we connected with persons, it was through these trade unions. And you spoke about Audrey Jeffers, and I love that. Elma Francois as well, she was a feminist trade unionist. And all of these women and men that connected with groups and underrepresented persons, I think we need to move back to that and move away from fear-mongering, move away from being divided by race, being divided by ethnicity, and that is how we can move forward.
So let's add another spin to our solution of engagement. What incentives, so before we talked about what can we do to increase voter participation and access to our rights, but what incentives from a state perspective or even from an EBC perspective that can be done to increase voter turnout? And I would use one example. I don't know if you guys might agree with me or disagree, but Australia, voting is compulsory. You can be fined if you do not vote. Do you guys know this? Right? So Australia has a 90% turnout because legislatively under section 245 of their electoral act, it is mandatory to vote, and they do voting on a Saturday to ensure increased turnout. At their polling stations, they have coffee and tea stations and food for persons as they come in. So just as an example, Estonia people vote using mobile apps. They have a process called e-voting. So as we look to the future in the next 100 years, what do you think we should do as incentives to encourage voter turnout? Anyone?
As Shane mentioned, most of our population, possibly young persons as well, some of us are not informed. So we do not know the role of local government, such an important election that takes care of our community, garbage collection, the role of an MP, the role of an alderman. And I think through EBC, maintaining their independence as they should educate, take that try to educate the population on these various roles of our parliamentarians, of local government, and especially the importance of it. I think that definitely needs to be done. If it cannot be implemented, because we haven't seen it in our school system, at least, through the EBC, put that knowledge out there to make persons better informed.
And if I reflect on my days of social studies, discussing how the parliament runs, MPs, this is something that is part of the curriculum, that is an intentional process. So what else do you think we can do to increase agitate voter participation from an incentive perspective as well?
Yeah. So when we look at, again, 100 years, and we spoke about the earlier elections, the voter turnout would have been high. And of course, those would have been new government, new opportunity. It was optimistic. But of course, Shane mentioned 60 plus years of PNM, 30 plus years of the United National Congress. And political capital is something I think both major parties would have to work on. And I say that because there's pros and cons of holding power. One of it is maybe not delivering on some of the things that you said you were going to deliver on. And people will hold you to account on it. And persons will hold you so far to account and say, I don't vote at all. And I'm not even going to listen to you. So I would like to see meetings. You spoke about incentives, but I personally would like to see meetings come out of the so-called die-hard areas of the political parties, or where the bases may fall or be, We have UWI, we have UTT. I would love to see conversations happening within the tertiary level institutions. I mean, it happens in the United States all of the time. You have political activists who would go there and advocate, and you have persons lined up and they're having a debate. You know, if it is you're on the Democratic side. I mean, and it's not just that. These issues, some of the issues that we would have heard about were women issues, gender issues, and you heard a level of robust debate, you know, impassioned, but robust, productive. I think that engagement would, of course, really assist in maybe having young people at least understand what your offering is, and we may have interest in either voting or not voting for you.
So to your point, Chris, you're talking about increasing points of distribution, right? How do we get to non-traditional spaces that would increase that conversation? Maybe this is why we would have seen that political shift in Tobago, right? You know, the street corners, getting two people, non-traditional spaces to increase that conversation. You know, as we close, you know, I really want to thank you all for bringing to this space as we discuss what history looks like of this 100 years. More importantly, what obtains presently and what we could expect in the short distance of 2025 and what we can look forward in the future. A common thought I want to leave with us is, how do we see, as was mentioned in passing, how do we see campaign financing of parties, the expansion of parties, and possibly do we support the probability of public financing of political parties to be a part of this democratic process? Open question.
Well, I think the major political parties, I may assume, that this is something they may not be too interested in. If you know the business side of the politics and how investors may invest, you know, I think that's a nice way to put it. But I think if we are able to, if the citizens, majority of persons can clamor for it and pressure our parliamentarians to perhaps maybe discuss this, at least to discuss it, not in the parliament yet, you know, at least within their partisan areas. You know, I assume you engage in a political party, your policy must come from the members. Your goals and aspirations must come from members. And that's one of the issues I also think that we may have a problem with in the system, speaking about reform and reflecting on how we can do this thing better. If the political parties in Trinidad and Tobago are attracting the right people, are we attracting the persons with the best intentions, the brightest group of persons, the persons who will work the hardest? Or are we just attracting persons who, and we hear it all the time, eat a food politically, or carrying out an agenda? And so that is something too that maybe that needs to be discussed politically within the partisan system. And I hope maybe I could hear some of that in this election.
Well, probably Chris is advocating, you know, tangentially for public financing, because that's one of the effects of public financing. It increases diverse participation of persons who may not have the economic connection to be able to come into the landscape and make an impact. Thank you so much for your brilliant contributions, and more importantly, your thoughtful consideration as we celebrate 100 years as having access to the ballot, and as we look forward to 2025, you know, we encourage you as the Parliament, we encourage you to continue to lend your voices, create alternative media, have those types of conversations, and continue in that bold contribution as you have done today. So today I am your host, Mwale Henry, and we were discussing together, as you were part of this conversation, talking about our 100 years moving forward into 2025. I want to encourage you to subscribe to the Parliament channel and be informed, be a part of the conversation for the Parliamentary Conversation Youth Parliamentary Network. We thank you for being a part of this edition, and we look forward to seeing and talking with you in the future.